welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to be concluding a 4-part series on different graphics program for drawing quilt pattern illustrations. This is the 4th and final video in this series, and we are going to be covering a deep dive into InkScape, which is a free graphics program. It's open source on the web. You don't even need to create an account. You can just download it, and for a free software, it is extremely powerful. So I'll be walking you through kind of the features of this software that are relevant to you if you're going to be writing and illustrating quilt patterns. But if you haven't watched the first 3 videos in the series, make sure you go do that. There's a lot of good information in there, and it'll give you a better idea of what's out there and what might be right for you. So this is InkScape. This is the interface once you get it opened and start a file. You'll notice this actually looks pretty darn similar to Affinity Designer 2. I like to say this is like the cheap knockoff version of Affinity Designer 2. They are very similar, but there are kind of some key features with InkScape that are a little bit different. And to be honest, this is my least favorite in the series of softwares that we're covering because there's just a lot of unnecessary workarounds that you need to do in order to accomplish the same things that you would be able to do fairly easily in Illustrator and Affinity Designer. And on top of that, InkScape is known for being fairly buggy. It is an open source software, so you have a bunch of different contributors that each contribute different features to it rather than like a coordinated product software development team. And that leads to, again, just some weird quirks about the software because not everything is totally organized when they're implementing things. And that also leads to some bugs because this software is known for just kind of crashing on you. Usually you can recover most of what was in the file if you haven't saved recently. There is a fairly decent autosave recovery function, but sometimes you do lose information. And when you're down to the wire trying to write a quilt pattern very quickly, having it crash on you a lot is very, very frustrating. So take that with a grain of salt. If you are a hobbyist and you're just kind of getting into quilt pattern design, or you're not necessarily selling these quilt patterns or trying to make a business out of it, this could be a really great software for you because it is free and you're not going to be working to a deadline, right? It's not going to be that constant tug of war between time and money that a business always has. So let's get into it. This is the workspace as it normally opens. Again, you've got kind of this studio feature on the right here. And then on the left, you've got your quick access toolbars that looks very similar to both Illustrator and Designer. The right workspace or studio is very easy to customize. We can open a bunch of different tools and dock them to this sidebar and also customize it a little bit. In Inkscape, they're called extensions instead of tools. Again, this is just kind of a feature of that open source software, but you can open a bunch of different tools and kind of subroutines in here. And then once they're open, you can dock them into the sidebar and they're going to be there for you every time you open the software. You can also customize this to some degree, right? We can basically go into a different tab, move it down to the bottom one. We can pull it out entirely. But just like Affinity Designer, you do kind of have to get it aligned just so in order to get it to redock, which can be a little bit frustrating. Although I would say in general, this is probably a little bit easier to do than it is in Affinity Designer, at least for me. And then you can of course get rid of anything that you're not using by just closing it out. So if I don't need this export panel open, we can just close it. Path effects, we can close that. There's all kinds of different options that we can do here. So let's talk that shape builder function. Now, up until a couple of updates ago, Inkscape didn't actually have a shape builder function. So as far as utility for quilt pattern illustration, it has gotten a lot better over the last year or two. This thing used to be almost archaic to where you couldn't even figure out what you're looking at sometimes. Having access to that shape builder tool is really, really critical for quilt pattern illustration. So let's go again with that half square triangle that I've been demonstrating. So I'll just come up here and grab my rectangle tool. Just like the other 2 softwares, we'll just click in and get something started. But unlike the other 2, it's not just as simple as holding shift or something along those lines to get it to behave like a square. Those are hotkeys. It changes the functionality, but it doesn't necessarily behave the way that you want it to. Again, just little quirks. Whatever software you get used to will probably be okay, but you do have to get used to it. And this is different from some of the other graphic softwares out there. So once we've got a square, we can of course adjust the fill and stroke fairly easily. It's got kind of both of the options that you would have in Illustrator and Affinity Designer, right? You've got the kind of the same color wheel that we have from Affinity Designer 2, as well as your different shade and tone sliders that you would get from Illustrator. We also have our swatch options down at the bottom here. We can change our fill from black to pink or anything along those lines, and then adjust from there if we need to. For the stroke color, all we have to do is come into stroke paint, Right now it's off. And again, that's one of the quirks of Inkscape, just like we have with Affinity Designer, where the default is to give you no stroke. We can change that to give it just like a standard fill. And I would probably go with like a black color at this point. And now we've got our stroke and fill showing up on this bottom panel. Now, as far as swatches go, you don't have kind of these libraries of swatches that you do in Affinity Designer and Illustrator, but you've got so many options for color here that it's probably not that much of a drawback. And you can customize the swatches that you're going to get on this bottom toolbar as you start to build out like a color palette for the file that you're working in. To make this a half square triangle, we're again going to need a line tool. To do that, we'll just grab the pen tool, and just like Affinity Designer, you're going to want to make sure you're in the correct mode. So we definitely want to be in this straight line segment option. By default, that is what comes up in Inkscape, unlike kind of the curved options that you get in Affinity Designer tool, but there are different options for the way that you're going to start drawing lines, and you do have to make sure that you're in the right mode or you're going to get something that looks really wonky. So we'll just start by locking it to that top corner. We can hit Control here, and that is going to kind of confine us to a certain angle. Now, what is nice, I have to say about Inkscape, is that unlike Illustrator, where you can basically get an increment of 45 degrees, Inkscape will do 15-degree increments for you, which makes it a lot easier to do like hexagon shape patterns and things like that, versus Illustrator, you have to go in and rotate it by 30 degrees rather than just being able to hold a hotkey and keep it constrained to those angles. Now, because we're in line segment mode, it is going to try to just kind of continue that segment. So I could just keep clicking here and draw a big polygon if I wanted it to. I don't need that, right? So we're just going to hit Enter, and that will basically cancel that line option for us. So now we're ready to apply the shape builder tool so that we get, again, 2 triangles for a half square triangle instead of a square with a line through it. Just like usual, we'll highlight everything and then come in here and grab our shape builder tool, which is a very similar icon to what you get in Affinity Designer, by the way. I love how different softwares are just so similar sometimes. So we'll select our shape builder tool. And again, you do have a couple different modes up here, although not nearly as many as you do in Affinity Designer. We've got the add mode and the subtract mode. If I use the subtract mode and clicked one of these, I would basically end up with just the other half. It would erase that object altogether, which is not what I want. So we want to be in the add mode, and that's generally going to be the case for you if you're drawing quilt pattern illustrations. But we'll just click into one of these. We could click 2, and because this is a line over top of it, it will actually give us 2. But if you had kind of 2 shapes overlapping, it would add those shapes together, which is not necessarily the functionality you're looking for. So again, there's just some quirks about the way that the shape builder tool works in Inkscape, as with Affinity Designer, that isn't necessarily intuitive, that you just kind of have to get used to. So we'll come back to our select tool, and we should have 2 triangles now. We color this one, maybe green, something like that, and get our half square triangle patch. Now, if we want to make this that split quarter square triangle that we've been doing, again, we'll just need to grab our pen tool. We want to make sure we're in line segment mode. Again, we'll give ourselves a diagonal, and then I have to basically cancel that tool in order to keep it from continuing to try and draw on me. So now if I highlight everything and just grab my shape builder tool, you might be tempted to basically just click in here and drag, but this is what I mean by sometimes unexpected behavior. If I do that and come back to my select tool, it's going to give me just one triangle, right? Because I'm in add mode and that's all I highlighted, more or less. So this isn't a showstopper, right? But it is something you have to get used to because you're not necessarily getting what you expect on the first try, and you're going to have to kind of undo everything and redo it until you get the shape that you need. Now, what I can do is basically just click each individual shape independently rather than clicking and dragging. And if I do that, I will in fact get all of those 4 patches that I want. And then I can come up here and just kind of merge those 2 if I need to. Again, with the shape builder tool, we'll just click in and drag, and that'll give me that piece merged, but it has to be a 2-step process. If you didn't click every single patch, basically the only patches that you would end up with were the ones that you click. So if you don't click them all, you're not going to get them. Again, quirk of the behavior, it takes some getting used to, but the fact that this doesn't behave the way that you would expect it to, for me, is a fairly large drawback to this program, because it's going to take me a lot longer to draw my diagrams than it needs to, or than it would in another software. And again, when I'm trying to crank out a bunch of quilt patterns, I'm working for clients, I'm writing my own, I write a bunch of quilt patterns per year. Those little quirks will slow me down so much to the point where it's just not worth it. I'd rather just pay the money. The shape builder tool is something that you're using constantly when you are drawing quilt pattern illustrations, because this is how you basically cut off little slivers of shapes to show seam allowances, to show pieces joined, to show all of those little details that you need to have really good illustrations. And if every single time you have to use it, you've got to do a couple of extra steps to get there, it's going to add a lot of time for you. It's just not worth it for me. As with Affinity Designer, I have yet to find a way where you can actually hide the artboards. So the artboard that you started with or that you change the size to is the one that you get. There's no way to just kind of hide artboards in general and get a white background like you can in Illustrator, which again really bothers me, but that's kind of my personal pet peeve. That's not necessarily an issue with the software, but if you are going to find basically moving diagrams around on a white background versus gray background, constantly having to shuffle those things around and getting half on, half off, something to think about because there's no way to just hide artboards like there is in Illustrator. Two more features that are important for quilt pattern illustrations. The first is the ability to add those arrow end caps so that we can call it dimensions. As with some of the other softwares, it starts by just starting a line. And again, we need to hold control so that we lock our angle just like that. And then to add kind of those end arrows, we just make sure our shape is highlighted and then come into the stroke styles option, and I can add markers for both the beginning and end. And now we've got arrows on both of those ends. Now, kind of the cool thing about InkScape is that you can actually pick a marker for the center section as well. That's not going to put multiple arrowheads kind of in the middle of this, but if you had drawn a polygon, right, so you started one line segment and then just kept clicking to give yourself more line segments, it would put an arrow at the end of each of those line segments, essentially. Not terribly useful for quilt pattern illustration, but it's there. It's an interesting feature that's not really available on a lot of the other softwares. And again, when we choose these options, we can also change the scale of these things with respect to the stroke width and things of those nature. The stroke width in general is a little bit on the small side for me right now anyways. So if I bump that up, you'll see that the arrows kind of scale with the size of your stroke. So we've got to make sure we have a different panel open in order to access these features. I happen to have that open already, but if you didn't, you would just open it through the extensions toolbar. But once you get there, it basically functions exactly the same as it does in both Illustrator and Affinity Designer. There's not really any drawbacks here with InkScape with the arrows function. The last thing we really care about as quilt pattern writers is how to export these images. To do that, we again have to open another extension that I already happen to have open here, and that is the export panel. And similar to Affinity Designer, you do have to select whether or not you want the whole document. If you just want the page, which would give us that whole artboard, a specific selection, or you can do custom, right? So you can specify a specific window based on the object that you need, but that is more or less done manually, which I don't recommend. We can select a bunch of different file types here. We can choose if we want a background color or not, just like you can with most of these softwares. Your resolution, if you're using a file size that has pixels rather than vector-based graphics, and then select a location for it. Now, what I forgot to mention last week with Affinity Designer 2 and also with InkScape is that there is no panel where these things are saved. In Illustrator, you have that, right? You can open the exports panel and you can see everything that you've exported from that document. That's nice because if you end up changing colors later, right, you get the quilt pattern all written and then you decide to change the colorway and want to update all the diagrams in your pattern, you can make those changes and then you don't have to like collect everything for export all over again. You just open that export panel and you can just select all of the graphics that you already previously exported. You have them named properly and the location specified properly. And just click export and it's going to run through everything in that file and just put a new copy in that location. With both InkScape and Affinity Designer, you can't do that. You would have to go through this process of re-exporting every individual graphic all over again. If you do your darndest to not change the colors in your pattern or in your graphics after you've gotten the thing written, maybe this doesn't matter to you too much, but I've done it enough to where having all of those export files saved in that export panel is a really attractive feature of Illustrator for me. Alrighty, that's pretty much all I've got. I hope you enjoyed a deep dive into all of these softwares. To kind of summarize everything, I would say if you are planning to do this professionally or you're going to work as a tech editor or ghostwriter where you're getting paid to generate programs for people, working with magazines or fabric designers, fabric companies, Illustrator is probably the software for you. That is the industry standard. And if your time is worth a lot, it matters a lot to you and you don't have enough of it, Illustrator speeds things up for you with the workflows and features that it has, and it makes this process a lot quicker. Affinity Designer is a fantastic option for you if you're just kind of getting into this business. You don't know if you really want to invest fully in it, or you're just trying to get started and don't have a lot of capital to work with. It is a single fee and it's relatively cheap compared to Illustrator. And most of the features, while a little bit slower than Illustrator, work pretty well. There's not a lot of workarounds that you have to do, and it's a great program for those that are just kind of getting started or just writing for themselves a couple of quilt patterns a year. If you're just a hobbyist, that's where I would turn to InkScape. You don't want to invest any money into purchasing a professional graphics license, but beware. InkScape has a lot of quirks to it. We saw that with the shape builder tool. That's going to slow things down a lot. And just from a frustration standpoint, having to redo steps multiple times because there's some quirk about the tool that just makes it respond in a really weird, unexpected way gets frustrating to the point where you might not want to finish the pattern anymore because you're just done with it. It also has a lot of bugs. It can crash on you. That happens, but it's free. So if you're happy to kind of deal with those quirks and those features in order to not have to invest anything, it's a great option. But I think that if you end up wanting to build a business out of it, you're going to want to upgrade to something else later because there's enough quirks that get frustrating that eventually you're going to want something better. So that's kind of the softwares that are out there. These are, of course, not the only ones. There is CorelDRAW and a couple of other ones that are out there that are really popular for like people into laser cutting and things like that. Those are not free. As far as I'm aware, InkScape is the only free vector graphics program, but all of them to some degree do have some commonalities. It's just what kind of quirks are you okay with dealing with and which ones are you not okay with dealing with. That's really what should be driving your decision about which software you're going to invest in and use moving forward. I do have to say that I would pick one of these things. I would not try to learn them all. Working back and forth between a bunch of different software where the shortcut keys and the functions are all a little bit different screws with your head. It's not a fun time. There is a learning curve with any of these softwares, no matter how well built it is. So pick one, invest into that one, and really grow some expertise in it over time. Don't try to start with one and then very quickly move on to another one and then another one. To fully utilize any of these softwares, you do need to spend some time with them and just kind of work through that learning curve to get to the point where you're comfortable and you can rapidly write and draw your quilt patterns. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. I hope you found this series helpful. If you did, make sure you like and subscribe and let me know in the comments which software you use or which software you think you're going to use based on this video series. I'll be back next week with an all-new Tech Tip Tuesday video, so make sure you come back and check that out. See ya!